pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
We're privileged now to have in the studio Senator James Lankford, who is a senator from the state of Oklahoma. And I was just thinking, the first time I ever crossed paths with you, we were doing an event with Bott Radio Network in Oklahoma City. Right. And ever since then have been following your career. This book, Turnaround, America's Revival, is something I heard about when you were actually doing an interview with Hugh Hewitt and talking about the Chuck Wagon Diner. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But first of all, just thank you for being here today.
I'm glad to be able to be here.
I might just mention that you're going to be doing an event tonight. And even though this will air on Thursday, what's going on Wednesday night?
Yeah, doing an event that's partnered with the Bush Center and with Old Parkland to be able to just talk about the book and to be able to talk about where we're going as a country and how we can actually have a turnaround as a nation. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Might just mention we do have a link to your website. We have a link to the book so people can get it in hardback or Kindle, and so that is certainly the case. And since we're broadcasting here from Dallas, just down the road is, of course, where you went to school, and you were born in Dallas and actually went to school in Garland.
That's right.
And we were just talking about how 635 looks a lot different than it is when you and I were growing up.
It looks a lot different than during that time period as well.
Yes. Well, let's see if we can get into this a little bit. When I learned about you, I said I could relate to a man that actually was organizing debate in the 4th grade, in the band in the 6th grade, Latin club in the high school, and like you, I was able to figure out how to thread a film projector. So in some respects, nobody looking at your circumstances, your parents getting divorced, really in some difficult circumstances, that you would ever be a United States Senator.
No, this was never on my radar. It wouldn't have been on anybody else's radar as well. I was the nerdy kid that was in speech and debate from elementary school on, in Latin club, as you mentioned, all those things. But I never ran for office, not for student council, not for anything else. I was a youth pastor.
Yes.
Loved working in student ministry, really enjoyed that, did for 22 years in youth ministry, and thought that I was going to do that the rest of my life. And as my wife says, this was life's greatest interruption for us.
Yes.
To sense that God calling us to run for politics and in this particular role in the United States Congress. We spent about 7 months really struggling with God when we heard his call. And we kept saying, God, this is crazy. And he kept saying, come follow me. This is what you're called to do. And so I resigned my position. We took off.
And again, I might just mention, we'll get to that chapter on calling because I think it was very helpful. But again, just give the rest of your background. Of course, went to school in Garland, University of Texas, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, planning to be a youth pastor, then running a Christian camp. By the way, I love to speak at Christian camps because I've always said that when you can take God's word and put it in God's world, some things really happen. And you probably can give great testimonies of young people and adults that have become Christians right there at Christian camps.
That is exactly right. And what's interesting is even on the drive down from Oklahoma today here to Dallas and the meetings I've got here and the time with you, literally I stopped at a gas station and a young lady that worked at the gas station stopped me. She goes, you were the director of Falls Creek.
Yes.
And it was great to be able to visit with her. And she doesn't have the context for me as senator. She has the context for me as the director of the Falls Creek Youth Camp. And it is a great camp.
Yes. Well, again, I speak at Kennecott and the Kennecott Institute and run into students all the time that have graduated there, individuals from Pine Cove or a variety of others. And so, again, this is a great opportunity for people to talk about what is going on. But let me come back to that Chuck Wagon Diner because that's in Sperry, Oklahoma. Next time I'm in Oklahoma, I'm going to drive out of my way to go there because hearing you and Hugh Hewitt talking about this made me want to get the book and made me want to talk to you about that because basically these guys get around this round table and they solve all the problems in the world, don't they?
That's exactly right. And then they actually go to work to doing them. It's funny to me, the number of people that I see on a Friday morning or Saturday morning or whatever it may be, just friends that get together early at some Panera or some diner or someplace they like to go and just to be able to hang out and be able to visit. Most often around that circle, you'll find people just complaining about the world and what's going on. At the Chuck Wagon Diner, I was always amazed that group of men that sat around that table and ladies that would join them every once in a while, if they were brave enough to be able to join in the banter, that they would sit around that big oval table and they'd talk about what's going on in the community, then they'd start asking the question, what are we going to do about it?
Yes.
How are we going to fix it? And they would quietly go to work of trying to be able to fix the problems. If there was a problem at City Hall, if there was a problem with somebody that needed help in one of the areas, or they're complaining about a street, they would figure out how we're going to solve that. And then they'd just quietly get to work. And I thought it was a great model of leadership. Leadership doesn't just sit around and complain about an issue. They try to figure out how we're going to solve that.
Well, again, that's one of the chapters there. See a problem, be a leader. And it does seem to me, first of all, one of the lines that they said is smartphones messed everything up because they could then talk and not necessarily have an answer. But as soon as they said a smartphone was the worst thing ever invented, because then they'd look it up and they'd recognize, well, we've already solved the problem, or we gave the wrong piece of information. But that leadership is really an issue that runs through your book. And that is the fact that you're really coming to the issue of the common man. And we tend sometimes to say, well, those of you in leadership, you need to solve all the problems.
Right.
And really, the Chuck Wagon Diner is a good illustration of the fact that many of those problems can and should be solved at the local level or at the state level, not even at the federal level.
That's exactly right, or right in the community or the family level. We catch ourselves all the time complaining and yelling at the TV, and I try to remind everyone, they can't hear you when you're yelling at the TV. If there's a problem, here's the simple definition of leaders. A leader is not somebody necessarily with a title. They're somebody who sees a problem, asks somebody to help come solve it, and they start working on solving it together. That's what leadership is. You may get one other person to help you, or you may get 1,000. It doesn't matter. You're a leader when you actually notice the problem and say, somebody needs to resolve that. I'm going to start working on it. We need a lot more leaders in this nation. We can't just vote and say those people are the leaders, they fix everything. That's not how it works in real life, especially not America, where we're a representative republic. We're not a dictatorship that's looking to government to be able to solve all problems. We are still the people. And when we see a problem, whether it's in our family, our church, our community, our neighborhood, our schools, we got to just stop griping about it. We got to say, I see that. God help me. What do I need to do about that?
That is the interview that we did with James Lankford, and we're going to continue with that after the break. But I thought since we have a moment before we do go to the break, for those of you that have not heard, we also will spend some time today talking about the fact that Dr. James Dobson has passed away today, a psychologist, New York Times best-selling author. He's in the Radio Hall of Fame as a broadcaster, was an advisor to 5 U.S. presidents. And our good friend Gary Bauer said Dr. Dobson was a pioneer, a man of deep conviction whose voice shaped the way generations view faith, family, and culture. Went on to say a little bit later, his bold leadership, integrity, and compassion helped equip countless families to thrive in a world of shifting values. And then Gary Bauer says he was a mentor, a counselor, and a steady voice of truth in turbulent times. We will spend a little bit more time talking about Dr. Dobson, but since we wanted to, and not only give you the chance to hear the interview that I did yesterday with Senator James Lankford on his book Turnaround, I also, of course, wanted to spend just a little bit of time mentioning the fact that we have lost another great individual who has been on the program with us before. I've been on his program as well, and it's just a great loss that all of us well aware of, and certainly I would encourage you to pray for the family. Shirley, of course, still survives, wife of 64 years, also the children, Danae and Ryan, as well as daughter-in-law Laura and their 2 grandchildren. So did want to mention that. We will take a break, though, and when we come back, I want to continue my interview that we did with Senator James Lankford. Again, an individual that if you knew him before he was in the Senate, probably would never have guessed that he was a U.S. Senator, and there he is. So if we're willing to follow God's call, you never know where you might end up. Let's take a break. We'll continue the interview that we did yesterday right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent NPR story begins with this introduction. About a year before the pandemic hit, a scientist in China revealed that he had secretly engineered the birth of the first CRISPR gene-edited babies. The scientist was imprisoned for 3 years for violating medical regulations, but now some are beginning to suggest we should begin to genetically engineer babies. One bioethicist observes there seems to be a convergence of people who are thinking that they can improve their children whether it's their children's health or their children's appearance or their children's intelligence. In fact, one company startup in New York City is called the Manhattan Project and has plans to explore how to do gene corrections in human embryos. The story ends with some reminding us to move fast and break things does not work well in Silicon Valley. He then concludes that in healthcare, because you're talking about reproduction, the things you're breaking are babies. My booklet on a biblical view on genetic engineering makes a distinction between genetic repair and creating new forms of life. We live in a fallen world, Genesis 3, which was not part of God's plan for the world. Genetic engineering to treat and cure genetic diseases should be seen as exercising our dominion over the creation in Genesis 1:28. We don't have the scientific foresight nor the moral wisdom to create new forms of life or significantly modify human beings. As ethicist Leon Cass observed, engineering the engineer seems to differ in kind from engineering the engine. I'd be glad to send you my booklet because we need to think biblically about genetic engineering. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Again, Senator James Lankford with us. The book is entitled Turnaround, America's Revival. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we'll have it on the website there at pointofview.net so that you can get it. And I would certainly recommend it to you because it is certainly getting into the kind of issues we talk about every single day here on Point of View. And you said at one point, I have a confession to make. I'm obsessed with the biblical story of Nehemiah. So for just a minute, I'm going to have you put on your pastor's hat for just a minute. A couple of great books that I might recommend on Nehemiah. One by Chuck Swindoll, a good friend, Hand Me Another Brick. One by also James Maxwell and some others. So there are some great books, but in some respects, that is the illustration that we need to provide, and that is when it came time to build the wall, each person built the wall next to them. Right. And it really brings us back to this idea that we don't always need to look to Washington, D.C. or to Albany, New York, or Tallahassee, Florida, or Sacramento, California, or Austin, Texas to find our solutions. Right. We can create our own right there in our own community.
Yeah, there's so many leadership lessons for the book of Nehemiah. I mean, Nehemiah chapter 1 opens with Nehemiah talking to his brother Hanani. Hanani had just come back from Jerusalem, and Nehemiah says to him, what's it like there? They're both slaves living in a foreign land in exile. It's been 100 or so years that they've been there as a community. And he looks at him and says, what's it like in Jerusalem? And Hanani says, oh, it's terrible. It's awful. The wall is down. The gates are burned. The people live in total disgrace. And Hanani walks off. Nehemiah drops to his knees and says, God, that's awful. What should I do about it? Begins praying and then takes the next step. And when he goes to Jerusalem, and it's a miraculous whole series of events that he gets there, when he gets to Jerusalem, he starts the most simple thing. Start working on the broken down part of the wall next to your house. Now, He gets some other help from some other people in the community, but it was the most basic thing. If it's broken next to your house, start working there. We can't just look at problems in Washington and far away. We should say, what is my part? what is next to me that I can actually work on, and what would happen if each of us started working on the part next to our house.
The other part of that is, and can you talk about that in Foundation, it is that they both set a guard and they both prayed. And we have some people that are so spiritually minded, they're no earthly good, and they're so earthly minded, no heavenly good. It's not an either or, it's a both and. We really need, if we're going to bring about a revival in America, there are solutions in the political arena, there's solutions in the cultural arena, and there's solutions in the spiritual arena. And that's one of the things I like about your book, because you cover all of those in a way that, unfortunately, not everybody in the United States Senate would actually address in that regard.
Well, the hope of the world is not Washington, D.C. The hope of the world is in Christ. And I try to tell everyone all the time, Washington doesn't change the country changes Washington. And so then the question comes, what changes the country? It's the gospel and the church. When we actually engage through our church and minister to people and engage in real conversations, begin to not only pray about, God, what would you have me do? What is the issue that you want me to work on? And begin to impact your own community. That has an impact on the larger community and then on the nation. So if you want to change the nation, start with changing each community.
Part of that is finding your calling. Sometimes people say, I don't understand what I need to do. Should I go to law school? Should I go into the ministry? Should I certainly maybe develop certain types of skills? And I say, well, a lot of it gets back to your calling. Right. And here, as you point out, I did not anticipate running for the United States Congress. In fact, it was never on the family radar. No one would come up to you and say, you should be a United States Senator, but you could not shake that calling. And it does seem to me that your experience is helpful, because I say if you have a medical background, then you need to stand for the right to life. If you are in the legal profession, you need to really be an honest individual and really call for an honest assessment of the legal issues, and maybe even call for a constitutional return to this republic. If you're a parent, you should recognize you're raising the next generation to the glory of God. So in some respects, the answer to how I get involved comes back to calling, doesn't it?
It does, actually. And I'm a big believer in turning around and looking backwards and saying God uses each day today to prepare you for tomorrow. Now, we don't know what tomorrow is, but He does. And so we should turn around and look back and see kind of the signposts. What are the things and the experiences that He's taken me through to be able to point the direction that we're actually headed? Now, I tell you, even saying that, no one looks at their youth pastor and says, you should be a United States Senator. Okay, that just doesn't happen in a normal setting on that. Yeah. But when I turn around and look back and some of the research that I'd done and speech and debate that I'd taken on and places that I'd been and people that I had met, when God really interrupted our life and called us, and we struggle with that calling to say, God, how can this be the calling that you're taking to? When we began to pray about it, and we took that next step to be able to go, and we saw the relationships and the people and the process and the attitudes and issues for us. So, and we could see it turn around looking backwards. We definitely couldn't see it looking through a glass darkly looking forward.
Yes. But let's, if we can, talk about, because that gets into some of the other chapters, the problems. You know, we are angry, we are divided, we're polarized. The differences even in the United States Senate are really amazing to me that I don't remember existing. I did a commentary a while back, and I was critical of one of the other senators who was going on and on and on and on in a filibuster that was meaningless, and then criticizing his fellow Democrats. But I said, this is the Senate that was supposed to be the greatest body for discussion and deliberation in the world, the greatest deliberative body. And that's changed in the United States Senate in unfortunate ways. You think of Henry Clay, you think of, for example, Daniel Webster, you think of some of the great speeches even during the Civil Rights Movement in the United States Senate. That's not the United States Senate today, and I would hope that somehow we could turn that around.
It is. The Senate is a place constitutionally that's designed where Americans get together that disagree and figure it out. The House is a majority-only body. Of course, the executive branch is the determination of one person, one leader. The Supreme Court is a majority body. The Senate is the only place in government where both sides have to be heard. And it drives us crazy when you're in the majority. But when you're in the minority, you also know, I've got to be heard. It's this uniquely American institution where both sides have to sit down like grown-ups and fight it out and figure out how they're going to solve it. That's a good thing for us as a country, and that should force debate. But you're exactly correct. What is caused of late is us just to go into our corners and complain about the other one. We have to do what Americans have to do every single day in their families and their schools and their workplaces and communities. Sit down with people you disagree with, figure out how we're going to be able to solve it. That doesn't mean giving up your values. It often means I don't get to go as far as I wanted to go,
right?
But I can go as far as I can get the other side to go and then convince the rest of the country we need to go farther. That just takes time. We're moving 340 million people through an issue and an idea, and sometimes that takes a couple of years to go through it, but we shouldn't just yell at each other and think that solves the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. We were all elected to do hard things. This is hard. So let's go work on the hard work.
Some of the individuals are saying, well, democracy is broken, so we need to fix it. And James Carville, I don't quote him too often, but just the other day said, well, we just need to have more senators, so we'll have Puerto Rico be in a state, the District of Columbia be a state. We probably need some more Supreme Court justices, so we'll get 13.
Yep.
And it does seem to me that if we aren't careful, those voices will eventually win out, and that really would be the end of the republic as we know it, don't you think?
It is. What they're trying to do is to be able to pack the court, load up the Senate, destroy the filibuster, and say we're going to just run over everybody and control it from the progressive left point of view. That is destructive to the country. That is destructive to our republic. And what I say to people all the time when they say, gosh, things are broken, things are terrible, I'm like, okay, stop. If things are terrible, then let's pray about what we need to do to be able to fix it and start fixing it, because the generation behind us just hears it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. So their natural response is what we're already seeing in a lot of universities. Well, if a constitutional republic doesn't work, what does? Maybe we should look at socialism. Maybe we should look at other things. You look at New York City right now.
That's
in
right.
the wave of socialism moving through. That's not coincidental. That's lots of adults complaining about our democracy. And so there's lots of younger people saying, well, if that doesn't work, what might? And I can assure you, Canada and France and China are all saying our model works better. We know it does not, but we need to stop complaining about where we are and fixing it. Our problem isn't our Constitution. Our problem is we aren't living or practicing our Constitution. So let's get back to doing that, and the next generation can see what a turnaround looks like.
And again, that's one of the reasons why we really believe that Point of View provides education. One of the booklets, we do a booklet every month, and one is on capitalism and socialism, but the most recent one is just on socialism. Right. And here is the track record of all the countries that have tried socialism. And I know that the individual running for mayor in New York City, also the one running for mayor in Minneapolis, thinks that socialism is the best. And yet, unfortunately, there are a lot of young people that go off to some of those universities and are convinced that socialism is preferable to capitalism. It's not.
It's not.
And I think we need to educate people about that as well. Going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll continue just the last part of the interview with Senator James Lankford. The book is entitled Turnaround, America's Revival. Just a great resource, and I think it would be an encouragement to you, and we have information about it on the website. Of course, you can also find it in your local bookstore. We'll be back with more right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again to the interview I did just yesterday with Senator James Lankford. So one of your other chapters dealt with neighbors and enemies, and I was thinking a while back when we talked with former Senator Ben Sasse.
Yeah.
He's written about this idea of them, and the fact is there is a real need that if we look at the division in the U.S. Senate, maybe we need to come back to our local communities because there's division there. And do you even know who your neighbor is across the street?
Right. Yeah. Ben Sasse, a great leader, and he's much missed in the United States Senate. He was a terrific leader while I was there, senator from Nebraska. But I would tell you that this whole concept of love your neighbor and love your enemies is a strong biblical concept. But for whatever reason right now, we've got more and more people, even people in the church, that are saying, I'm going to love who I want to love and hate who I want to hate. And we get celebrated on social media. The more that you hate and the snarkier that you are, the angrier that you are, the more divisive that you are, you get more likes and that algorithm moves. And so literally our culture confirms and affirms being snarky, being angry, being divisive, when Jesus is standing in the corner saying there's two great commandments. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There's no commandments greater than these. And I look at our culture and say, I think those two things are still true. So how do we do that no matter where we are? And I don't see an asterisk in my Bible that says that love your neighbor as yourself has a little asterisk next to it. It says, unless it's about politics, then stick them.
Yeah.
That's not in there. We have to figure out how to live that biblical principle, and we have to decide a very simple thing. Is the Bible true or not? If it's true, and I believe it is, then we've got to be able to apply that truth to all aspects of our life and figure out how I can strongly disagree with someone who I believe is wrong on an issue, and their beliefs are culturally damaging, biblically inappropriate, and also damaging to our families and our communities. How I can disagree with them strongly, but still love my neighbor as myself.
Very good. You know, one of the other things, Senator, we talk about is the need for people to have some kind of discernment, because you probably have learned that the mainstream media doesn't always accurately represent you.
I have noticed that.
And you do have a section in your book, which I thought maybe I wanted to give you a chance to speak to, because we are concerned about open borders. We're concerned about immigration. You were as well, but I can't imagine what it must be like to be on the receiving end of a level of propaganda against you and some of the things that you were doing at the time. And you do address it in the book, and I thought I'd give you a chance to speak to that issue because it is an illustration, again, just because one person says it, just because somebody was using it as clickbait, just because somebody's accusing you of betraying the fundamental principles that you believe in, doesn't necessarily mean that it was true, right?
Yeah, it's exactly right. My favorite quote from Abraham Lincoln is, don't believe everything you read on the internet. It's a very simple principle that I put out there, the chapter that I call a case study on D.C. politics and social media.
Right.
It was literally a chapter I was not planning to write. And
Chapter 10.
My beautiful bride came to me when I was in the middle of writing. This book took me about 3 years to write, and we were getting close to the end of all the writing, and she said, you need to write a chapter about that. And I said, I'm not planning to. She said, no, you need to. And it ended up being the longest chapter in the book, amazingly enough.
Yeah.
But the chapter itself walks through that
Rumors
big fight
and
about
misrepresentation.
Correct.
And,
the big fight on the border issues, on what the border bill included and what it didn't include, and what it became on social media versus what it actually was on the text. And one of the examples I give is the number 5,000. It really became the signature number for the border bill, where people said, well, the border bill allowed 5,000 people a day, every day, to cross the border before we did anything. And I kept yelling, no, it doesn't. But social media said it did. And so it was, quote unquote. But it never was. The bill itself changed the law dramatically, where the first person that crossed every day would be arrested, screened under a brand new process, and would be deported within hours or days. But if we got to 5,000 people a day, and remember at that time we're writing the bill, we had 12,000 people a day every day crossing the border illegally. If we got to 5,000 a day, we're overmanned. We can't handle it. So it made the rules even tougher that day. So you wouldn't be screened anymore. You'd be just arrested and deported. But people saw the 5,000 number. The social media said it allows 5,000. It actually got even tougher at 5,000. It was tough at 1. And it got even tougher at 5,000 to make sure that we never had an out of control with 12,000 people ever again. We always had authority of our own border. But the lesson there is really to be able to track what you see on social media. Sometimes when it sounds crazy, It actually is.
Yeah, 5,000 had a life of its own.
It did.
It just is amazing to me how that was so misunderstood, and I think deliberately at some points misunderstood. But look at the difference now, because they're saying that border encounters are down, 97% or something like this.
It's 99.5% down.
Yeah, I've heard that the other day too, so I wasn't sure which number to use, but it's all. And I think it illustrates again that if you wanted to actually deal with the open border, it didn't mean that you needed to pass another law. You just needed to elect a different president.
Yeah.
And the same kind of thing is happening right now in the District of Columbia. When I went to Georgetown, of course, I can tell you that there was certain places in D.C. that I would go to, and certain places I know even as a United States Senator with an entourage you wouldn't go to. And all of a sudden we have all sorts of people showing up. And who would have guessed, even this last hour, we talked about John Lott saying that if you put people out on the streets, guess what? Criminals then don't act out. If you deport individuals that have a criminal record, the criminal rate goes down. The murder rate, if it continues, Senator, is going to be the lowest we've ever seen before. So who knew?
Which would be great. It's basic enforcement. Again, humanity does what humanity does. And if it's unchecked, we're not angels as people. It is helpful to be able to have a highway patrolman on the highway every once in a while, making sure we all honor the speed limits, making sure we're not speeding in the school zone. But it's also out there in dangerous places to be able to make sure that we actually limit crime. When people are afraid, I will be prosecuted, they tend to be able to pull back and say, I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to be actually prosecuted on that. When people have no fear of prosecution, if they know I can walk into a store and I can steal $950 worth of stuff, and you only get prosecuted if you steal $1,000, I'll steal $990 worth of stuff and walk out of the door and know I won't be prosecuted. That's true in California today. And so it's rampant in crime in many of these stores because they know they won't be prosecuted. They know they can get away with it. That's a problem for culture. That's a problem for the next generation. And it's something we have to address.
Well, again, the book is entitled Turnaround, America's Revival. And I know I need to let you go in just a minute, but I thought I'd just at least give you a chance to talk about what your optimism is for America, because you give some very concrete statements. 14 chapters really address all sorts of practical things that we can do. And we shouldn't always look to Washington. We shouldn't always look to you senators to solve all our problems. We can solve many of them at the local level. But again, I sense that you have a real optimism for the future. What about that?
I do have an optimism for the future. We're facing a lot of problems. I mean, debt and deficit is enormous. No one can process $37 trillion in debt, what that's really going to mean for the country. But we are Americans. We have taken on a lot of hard problems before. We've addressed them when we're willing to be able to actually confront the problem, and we have solved just thousands upon thousands of problems. You think about the things that have come out of the United States, the creativity, the innovation that's happened over and over again. We're a nation that loves that innovation, but we're also a nation that understands government's not the solution. Government's not God. Okay, when we see problems and solutions, we don't immediately turn to government and say, you got to fix this. We look at each other and we say, let's get started. Let's take the opportunity to be able to be together. So my concern on the book was we're looking more, even as conservatives, looking more and more to D.C. and saying they're going to solve all these things. D.C. is not the Messiah nor the source of the Messiah. That is a place that has a job. We should do our job in D.C., but each of us as Americans should also do our job as well. When that occurs, that's when a national turnaround occurs. When we're lazy enough, if I can be bold to say that, to just sit back and say I voted, then they're going to solve everything, that's when we watch everything fall apart. So for me, it's not just who's president now. It's who's president 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 30 years from now.
That's right.
And who are we going to be as a country, and how are we going to operate, and what's the legacy we're going to pass on to the next generation? So my challenge is just being angry is not going to solve it. Actually solving the problem is actually what actually solves the problem. So let's find ways that we're going to do that locally, individually, as a family.
Turnaround, America's Revival, written by the Senator, and it has just been a delight to have you in the studio.
Thank
and
you.
Look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you. Look forward to that.
Back once again, James Lankford was with us in studio yesterday. And of course, now we're back live here on Thursday because we have certainly a lot to talk about. But let me just mention, the book came out in April. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, of course, we always provide you with an opportunity to know more about it by going to the website pointofview.net. And you can get it in both hardback and Kindle. And I would recommend that you do so. I think it will give you some encouragement, gives you some of the backstory, and it's always great great to hear from, whether it is Senator Marco Rubio, who was with us before he became Secretary of State, or in this case, James Lankford. Of course, we mentioned a number of other individuals, Senator Ben Sass, former senator, and a variety of others that have been on the program. So anytime we can bring to you an individual, in this case, wanting to be in studio and talk about a book and talk about his career, we thought that that would be helpful to you. We come back, though, I do want to pick up a few things that he mentioned real quickly. And, of course, if you just joined us, I did mention that Dr. James Dobson has passed on. We'll spend some time talking about that perhaps next hour as well. And we'll also focus maybe even a tribute to him on Friday. Those of you watching on Facebook or on our broadcast, you'll also see some material that we've posted visually for you to see. Let's take a break, though. We have a lot more to talk about. Be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, of course, yesterday we had the opportunity to interview Senator James Lankford. You had a chance to hear the interview. But one of the things we said in the interview was what has happened to the United States Senate. And just for a minute, I thought I would give you a preview of a commentary coming out. And it has to do with the fact that we are never really sure who actually coined the term that the U.S. Senate was the world's greatest deliberative body. We talked about that a minute ago. It's oftentimes been attributed to James Buchanan. And so President Buchanan gets the credit for referring to the U.S. Senate as the greatest deliberative body. As I mentioned in the interview, you think about some of these great speeches by Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, but that's not the U.S. Senate of today. The senators today spend most of their time voting on routine presidential nominations to executive and judicial branches. And as we've already documented, unfortunately, these nominations aren't moving through in any kind of speed at all, so they're not even doing that efficiently. So you're saying, what in the world is going on in the U.S. Senate? And even when the Senate does consider key pieces of legislation, and those move through at a sort of a glacial pace, they don't come through very quickly. Many of the bills, most of the bills, are crafted behind closed doors, brought directly to the Senate, sometimes without even committee consideration. And so in many cases, then when there is a debate, the debate is usually truncated and tightly controlled. And so it is illustrative of the fact that the U.S. Senate is dysfunctional. And I've pointed out that there's some reasons for that. Some of those are left over from the days in which Aimee Byrd was the Senate Majority Leader. As I've said before in some of my commentaries, I think he still rules from the grave because of a parliamentarian that is given, I think, entirely too much power to determine what can or cannot be in a bill like the Big Beautiful Bill, but also the fact that up until fairly recently, even when the Senate was in recess, the Senate was not considered in recess, which prevented the possibility of recess appointments, and we are waiting for hundreds of appointees to get their opportunity to come before the Senate and be confirmed, or in some cases denied. And so one of the things that I talk about in an upcoming commentary is a quote from an individual that we quote quite often, George Washington law professor Jonathan Turley, because he illustrated that by pointing to Senator Cory Booker as one of the reasons for the decline. As I mentioned, he was engaged in this long and meaningless filibuster, but then goes on a rant about legislation that was put forward by his fellow Democrats, and they were critical of him because, first of all, he misrepresented this particular bill on police reauthorization. He didn't even, according to one or two of the senators, attend the committee meetings, and yet was critical of it, and also then rejected the idea that passing any kind of meaningful legislation, since it relates to police reauthorization, is making the Democrats complicit with Republicans. Okay, I figured out he's running for the presidency. I think his chances are slim and none, but that's the way, unfortunately, as we talked about just a minute ago with Senator James Lankford, you sometimes get attention by being crass, by being loud, by being critical, and all of the rest. But nevertheless, I would have to say that some of the antics, some of the language really have cheapened political debate. And I quite frankly want to say that I think it has really tarnished the image of this political institution, which used to be referred to as the world's greatest deliberative body. Let's see if we can turn that around, maybe even in this next election. So one of the reasons why I wanted you to hear from a U.S. Senator is so we could also talk about that issue. And that's an upcoming commentary. But if you go to the website today, you'll see that my commentary today is about genetic engineering. And this one is a source of some concern, and that is we recognize the fact that indeed genetic engineering can begin to treat and cure different kinds of genetic diseases. From a biblical point of view, we can even say, look, we live in a fallen world, and because of that, genetic repair and even doing some things to exercise stewardship or dominion, so one of the biblical words that's used in the Old Testament, is certainly permissible. We've been able to eradicate various diseases from our world's population, and so genetic engineering could certainly bring about some positives as well. But the same technology that allows you to treat and cure different kinds of genetic diseases also could allow you to create new forms of life and even genetically engineer future human beings. And so I open with a story that we talked about the other day with our friend Dr. Merrill Matthews. It was a story on NPR about the fact that there was a Chinese scientist who actually did secretly engineer the birth of these gene-edited babies. He was in prison for 3 years, but guess what? Now he's in the United States, and he wants to do it again. And so, whereas before, there were people saying, well, that's just not permissible. We cannot do this kind of genetic repair. Now, one of the bioethicists I quote in my commentary today says there seems to be a convergence of people who are thinking they can improve children, whether it's their children's health or their appearance or their intelligence. They're now, I think, posted, I saw just today, somebody said, would you spend $50,000 to increase your future child's intelligence? So we're starting to see that individuals, there's startup companies and others that are wanting to do more than what you might call gene correction. They want to do gene improvement. And you can begin to see there are some real concerns there as well. Again, one of the things I like to provide from time to time, whether you are a supporter of Point of View or not, are some of the booklets that we make available. And in the commentary, I make available the opportunity for you to get a copy of A Biblical Point of View on Genetic Engineering. By the way, if you receive that particular email, because we do send it out, you can just click on that right there, and you can then actually download it or read it online. So you don't even necessarily, if you don't want to, have to send us your address. Although if you did, I'd love to send you one of our booklets, because those little booklets are fairly easy to read, and I think certainly one that I would recommend. But in there, I point out, again, how to think about this from a biblical point of view, but even just from a common sense point of view. I also then make the case that we really don't have the scientific foresight, nor do we have the moral wisdom to create new forms of life or to even significantly modify human beings. One of the people I quote, who I studied when I was in the Kennedy School of Bioethics, was an ethicist by the name of Leon Cass. He had a great turn of phrase. Engineering the engineer seems to differ in kind from engineering the engine. And once we start down that road, I think we've got some real concerns. So let me just mention, first of all, that we do have available that particular booklet on genetic engineering. If you go and would like to get a copy of the book by Senator James Lankford, you can look for it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have that on the website. And as you go there, what will pop up as well is our $10 campaign, so that if you have not joined with us, you can do so. But right above it, Karen has posted a nice tribute that we have provided to Dr. James Dobson, A Life Celebrated. So again, you can go to the website today, find that tribute. You can find information about the book, the booklet, as well as an opportunity. If you would like to help us out, maybe you could just chip in $10 and help us. That would be greatly appreciated. Let's take a break. When we come back, a lot of things to cover in this second hour, but I hope you've appreciated the first conversation we had with the senator and some of the other material we've covered. We have a lot more to deal with, and we will cover that right after these important messages.
Point of View began all the way back in 1973 as a listener-supported ministry, and we are still a listener-supported ministry. But you know, out of the hundreds of thousands of Point of View listeners, just 1% donate to keep the program going. Imagine what would happen, how many people we could reach together if the 99% stepped up to donate as well. It doesn't take much to make a difference. In fact, we've done the numbers, and if every listener gave $10, Point of View would be funded for an entire year. If you're in the 99%, why not join the team of listeners who make Point of View a reality for everyone else? Chip in your $10 today. You can give online at pointofview.net. Or you can use your phone and call right now at 1-800-347-5151. Again, that's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's see if we can get into a couple of the articles I've posted for you today. And the first one is written by Dan McLaughlin, What David Brooks Missed. Now, David Brooks is called a conservative and on New York Times, and there are times when we might say, well, I don't know how conservative those ideas are, but I appreciate his comments. And, of course, we've had Arthur Brooks on all the time. It's been a while since we had David Brooks on, so not to confuse the two. David Brooks, of course, writing for the New York Times. And interesting enough, Dan McLaughlin points out something that ended up in the conversation with Senator James Lankford. Now, you got to understand that I posted the articles before I even knew what we would talk about with Senator Lankford, but it fit very well. And it has to do with the fact that it used to be that people were joiners. And by joining together, this created some harmony. And now we are very isolated, partially because we aren't joining various organizations as much, and we are isolated because of social media. A great illustration of that, and I'll hold up this book, and I've mentioned it before, and I mentioned it in passing even in the interview with Senator Lankford, by Robert Putnam. It has the rather interesting title, Bowling Alone. Now, why did he use that? Well, those of us that are older remember a time when people used to be in bowling leagues. Now, there's just one illustration, but it's the one they use for the title of the book. And so if you were in a bowling league, you could be with people that might be dentists or doctors. They might be business people. They might be plumbers. They might be electricians. They might be teachers. And it, in a sense, illustrates the fact that we interacted with each other quite a bit. And what this particular book was pointing out is we were becoming more and more disconnected. Now, you can probably see that this book is 500 plus pages. Probably don't want to read it. But if you say, I'd like to read something about this issue, you've heard me say this before, but let me mention again, we have a booklet that I've done a while back, which is entitled A Biblical Point of View on Loneliness, because I think we saw that even more significantly during the pandemic and the lockdown. But it brings us back to the piece by David Brooks, in which Dan McLaughlin, first of all, quotes from what he said. And David Brooks, New York Times, said, more Americans used to join cross-class community organizations like the Rotary or Elks Club, but gradually highly educated people left them for professional organizations filled with others like themselves. One of the individuals that he's now quoting said, once highly educated Americans would have been members of leaders of such cross-class voluntary federations, but now many barely know them. And the point he's making is this self-segregation has been sort of symptomatic. And so one of the reasons why we see a separation between college-educated and not college-educated, between sometimes the elites and the rest, is that issue. Well, Dan McLaughlin appreciates that, but he goes on to say that there were a lot of other issues as well. He says, for example, Veterans of Foreign Wars was once a major community institution crossing class lines, just as military service was a common experience. That began to fray, he points out, during Vietnam, when college deferments meant that college-going young men were less likely to be able to be drafted and more likely to avoid the draft. With the passing of generations, of course, and a shift to an all-voluntary military, we see that has played out. But here now Dan McLaughlin gets the next point. But what Brooks is not bold enough to tell his leaders is this just isn't a class thing, it's an ideological thing. Progressive lawsuits, pressure campaigns, and marches through the institution had a lot to do with killing cross-class institutions, especially those that once served men. And the example he uses is the Boy Scouts, which I'm going to talk about. He says the Boy Scouts are Exhibit A of this dynamic. Dads and sons camping in the woods and learning knots and archery and the like was once an activity. It didn't matter if your dad was a surgeon or a bricklayer. Endless assaults on the Scouts, all-male environment, and resistance to gay scoutmasters was a big part of what decimated their ranks. And I thought I would tie that into a piece that came out today by Ann Coulter. We may get into it more tomorrow with our Friday weekend edition. But she starts out by talking about the fact that one of the things the Democratic Party is trying to do is try to attract more young white men, because white men vote more for Republicans, and young white men, interestingly enough, voted even more so for Donald Trump. And so the point that she was making is that this is something that they're trying to turn around. And then in the midst of this, it turns out that two authors, Robert Putnam, here's the book I just held up, and Richard Reeves in the New York Times, said that really one of the ways that you could reach out to young men is by bringing back the Boy Scouts. And so then that's where Ann Coulter reminds us, what happened to the Boy Scouts? Oh, well, they were completely vilified for so many reasons. She points out that, for example, when a troop of Boy Scouts took the stage in the 2000 Democratic Convention, they were getting loudly booed by the delegates because the Supreme Court had at this point declined the demand that was coming through the courts to allow gay scoutmasters. Within a few years of its founding in 1910, Scouts realized they needed to keep an eye on people that might be sexually abusers, so that's why they were not real keen, as you might imagine, on having gay scouts. Not that all would be, but some might. And so then, of course, you can talk about all the positives. 2/3 of the NASA career astronauts were Scouts. 41 were Eagle Scouts, including Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 8 and 13, who just died the other day, among others. Hank Aaron, Gerald Ford, Stephen Breyer, Sam Walton, Stephen Bechtel, Bill Marriott, Michael Jordan, Steven Spielberg. And in some respects, there was a study that showed that Scouts placed a higher value on honesty and integrity than boys that had not been through the Scouts. So, of course, what happened next was the attack from all sorts of major media and various gay activists. And as a result, the attack was so intense that in the 2013 pre-Super Bowl TV interview, President Barack Obama even criticized the Scouts, interestingly enough, because they needed to allow gays and lesbians to have the opportunity. Then you have the attack from Chase Manhattan Bank, Levi Strauss, CVS, Merrick, and all the others, and then a lawsuit that eventually went to the Supreme Court, and eventually the Boy Scouts, sadly, they shouldn't have, decided to cry uncle, and they allowed homosexuals, they allowed girls. Pretty soon it was not Boy Scouts, it was just Scouts USA. And then, of course, 2 years later, Times ran the headline, Boy Scouts seek bankruptcy to survive the deluge of sex abuse claims. And that was, in a sense, an institution which was at the very center of American life, and it began to be one of the most vilified institutions. The Scouts didn't change, America changed. And so again, there's a good reason why we aren't getting together, and part of it has to do to ideology. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A recent NPR story begins with this introduction. About a year before the pandemic hit, a scientist in China revealed that he had secretly engineered the birth of the first CRISPR gene-edited babies. The scientist was imprisoned for 3 years for violating medical regulations, but now some are beginning to suggest we should begin to genetically engineer babies. One bioethicist observes there seems to be a convergence of people who are thinking that they can improve their children, whether it's their children's health or their children's appearance or their children's intelligence. In fact, one company startup in New York City is called the Manhattan Project and has plans to explore how to do gene corrections in human embryos. The story ends with some reminding us to move fast and break things does not work well in Silicon Valley. He then concludes that in healthcare, because you're talking about reproduction, the things you're breaking are babies. My booklet on a biblical view on genetic engineering makes a distinction between genetic repair and creating new forms of life. We live in a fallen world, Genesis 3, which was not part of God's plan for the world. Genetic engineering to treat and cure genetic diseases should be seen as exercising our dominion over the creation in Genesis 1:28. We don't have the scientific foresight nor the moral wisdom to create new forms of life or significantly modify human beings. As ethicist Leon Cass observed, engineering the engineer seems to differ in kind from engineering the engine. I'd be glad to send you my booklet because we need to think biblically about genetic engineering. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to move on in just a minute, but while we're talking about this issue of loneliness, I'll hold up our booklet on a biblical view of loneliness, and when I looked at it, I realized that we did, of course, talk about this book by Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, and also it quotes from Ben Sass, Senator Ben Sass, who we talked about with Senator James Lankford, Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal. These are some newer books that have addressed this issue, but also one of the other books I mentioned goes all the way back to the late 1980s. There's a book by Dan Keeley called Living Together, Feeling Alone, Healing Your Hidden Loneliness, in which he was even identifying then. This is before the advent of social media, before the advent of people having computers and all sorts of things that would distract them, but in which he was talking about this idea of living together loneliness. And even though he was talking about that in the 1980s and early 1990s, we are seeing that more than ever before. So it's once again a reminder of some of the things that we've talked about here on Point of View. Maybe we need to wean ourselves and our children and grandchildren off of social media. Maybe we should go back to being joiners of some of these various civic groups. Again, Edmund Burke used to refer to the little platoons that make up the difference. And as I mentioned before with Senator James Lankford, many of of the problems that we look to Austin, Texas, Albany, New York, maybe California, Sacramento, California, Tallahassee, Florida, whatever, to solve really can be solved at the state level, the local level, maybe the family level. We certainly don't need to be looking to Washington, D.C., or even to the state. We could perhaps solve some of those problems ourselves. And so, again, that's kind of the theme of his book. But let's get to some other issues. One of my other articles I've posted here, I have a smile on my face, and that is Noah Rothman says, new left-wing publication discovers timeless conservative wisdom. Who knew? Well, it turns out that there's a new left-wing publication, it's left of center, obviously, called The Argument, and it's really based upon this idea that we could bring together individuals who could then talk about this issue of abundance, because that's kind of a big issue. Progressives are trying to say we can have abundance without believing in free markets, without believing in capitalism. I think it's kind of a mess, but nevertheless, they are believing that that is the case. And one of the themes that runs through the Abundance book, and I don't recommend that you read it unless you want to write a commentary on it or something like that, is the idea of universal basic income. Now, Chuck Bentley, who is with Crown Financial, been on the program many times before, wrote a booklet a while back in which he has a whole chapter on the dangers of universal basic income. But you've had all sorts of Democrats and progressives and liberals that have all really talked about this idea of UBI, universal basic income. There were people in the Democratic primary in 2020, I should say, and then again a little bit in 2024, but especially in 2020, that were talking about this. And so we have this article in The Argument by Kelsey Piper, and she takes on this issue of, well, if we give people money, then certainly their conditions will improve, society will improve, and this will be a real benefit. And so, as again, Noah Rothman points out, her approach is not adversarial. She's just as shocked as you are, dear reader, to discover that when you give all sorts of income transfers to individuals, in other words, you give them universal basic income, it doesn't improve individual outcomes. It doesn't improve personal satisfaction. As a matter of fact, it many times really makes things worse. Now, if you have been getting some of my commentaries, I've quoted some of the other studies, but let's just go to this particular one, which Kelsey Piper talks about. And she says many of the studies are still ongoing, but at this point, the results aren't uncertain. They're pretty consistent and very weird. So here's what Kelsey Piper, a liberal progressive, has to say about what they found. Quote, multiple large, high-quality randomized studies are finding that guaranteed income transfers do not appear to produce sustained improvements in mental health, stress levels, physical health, child development outcomes, or employment. Treated participants do work a little less, but shockingly, this doesn't correspond with either lower stress levels or higher overall reported life satisfaction. Homeless people, new mothers, and low-income Americans all over the country receive thousands of dollars, and it's practically invisible in the data. And so many important metrics, these people are statistically indistinguishable from those who do not receive this aid. This shouldn't surprise you. I mentioned just a few minutes ago David Brooks, but we've also had another individual on the program who is by the name of Brooks, who at Harvard has pointed out, interestingly enough, that what happens is that people get satisfaction from earned achievement. Individuals that are given money, individuals that win the lottery, they don't have the same thing. And so again, let's go back to this progressive liberal, Kelsey Piper, writing for The Argument. And he goes on to say, Noah Rothman points out, the author cannot stress how shocking she finds this results, but it's not clear why. Piper subsequently expands on the research that contributed to her bewilderment, and it seems intuitive that those who receive income supplements
both worked less but reported no personal, psychological, or material benefit for either themselves or their families as a result. Just giving people money did not and will not make its recipients measurably happier or healthier, or get them better jobs, or improve their children's intellectual development. Those are all quotes that come from the study. Why would anyone feel more economically secure if their security, as he says, is predicated on the perpetual disbursement of tax dollars from these different politicians? And I think it just is illustration of other studies that we've seen before. They did one in Finland you may have heard about, where they provided 2,000 unemployed people with basic income. And of course, they had no reporting requirements for 2 years. While the recipients did experience maybe more happiness and less stress than the control group, they found, to their distress, the program members were not encouraged by their guaranteed income to go out and find a job. They simply lopped off the pilot program's per diem, and the Finnish government finally concluded that it didn't work. They had wanted to apply this to even more individuals, but they didn't think they applied it to the 5.5 million people that would require across-the-board income tax hikes and all that. But again, the point was this is somewhat predictable. And again, going back to the final comments by Noah Rothman, he says, what's so interesting is that all of this takes no stock of the cost of the proposal. At the end of the last decade, hedge fund manager Ray Dalio, who I've quoted many times before, pegged the cost of providing every American with just $12,000 per year, which was the poverty threshold at the time, at roughly $3.8 trillion per year, in a year when total federal outlays, including defense spending and entitlements, was $4.4 trillion. And that was before COVID, the stimulus, the American Recovery Act, and the subsequent inflation that resulted in higher borrowing costs to everyone, including Uncle Sam. The bottom line is pretty simple if you haven't figured out by now. Giving people money that they didn't work for doesn't really improve their lot in life. It costs a lot, including, I'm glad that Ray Dalio did the calculations. At that time, it was $3.8 trillion. It's probably closer to $5 trillion now. We can't afford it, and it doesn't work. Nevertheless, we have individuals, as we just shared a few minutes ago when we were talking with Senator Lankford, who nevertheless want to give it another try and elect a socialist for mayor in New York City, maybe a socialist for mayor of Minneapolis, and then, of course, others that are sort of quasi-socialist in the Congress and in other state capitals as well. I think we have the facts. I think if you have any kind of biblical perspective, you know this isn't going to work. But nevertheless, it's just one more evidence that slap your forehead. Even a left-wing publication is discovering maybe there's wisdom in having people to work for their income rather than giving to them money with no strings attached. I think you know that wasn't going to work, and yet we've had time after time experiments where people have tried it and always shocked that it never really works. Well, let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, but certainly if you would like to find either of these two articles I've just mentioned, they're available on the website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, let me just mention tomorrow is our weekend edition, and Jeff Mateer will be with us, and Liberty McCarter. Looking forward to that, and a lot of great issues to address. As a matter of fact, the resolution of one of those that we talked about last Friday, isn't it amazing that sometimes just a letter from First Liberty to some school officials is enough to bring about a resolution? But we'll get into that because I think it illustrates how if you have a child or grandchild that's dealing with some of these issues, sometimes it's as simple as a letter. Sometimes they're going to dig in their heels and it leads to a lawsuit, but most of those times just educating people can make a real difference. So again, I think you'll appreciate that conversation tomorrow that we're going to have. And as I mentioned at the outset here, Dr. James Dobson died today, and we first of all want to point you to our website, pointofview.net. We've got this particular graphic in the middle. It says Dr. James Clayton Dobson Jr., a life celebrated. From the beginning, our founder, Marlon Maddox, welcomed his voice and valued his commitment to traditional family, happily sharing the books and vision of Focus on the Family. And through the years, we have continued to value the ministry that Dr. Dobson built. Today, we mourn the loss of a friend, and we honor the life and legacy he leaves behind. As the current president of Focus on the Family, Jim Daly writes, Dr. Dobson's presence will be sorely missed, but we rejoice in the knowledge that he's now joyfully in the presence of the God he served. Dr. Dobson, if you're not familiar, interestingly enough, was born in 1936 in Shreveport, Louisiana. He was the individual who founded Focus on the Family in 1977. And, of course, thousands and thousands of radio stations carried a Focus on the Family. Later, there was a conflict, and he then eventually started the James Dobson Family Institute. Our good friend Gary Bauer is part of that, and also began the Family Talk, a nationally syndicated radio program that continues on. Authored more than 70 books, Dare to Discipline, Strong-Willed Child, the list goes on and on and on. And as I quoted before, but it's worth mentioning again that Gary Bauer, Senior Vice President of that public policy at the James Dobson Family Institute, said that Dr. Dobson was a pioneer, a man of deep conviction, whose voice shaped the ways generations view faith, family, and culture. His bold leadership, integrity, and compassion helped equip countless families to thrive in a world of shifting values. He was a mentor, a counselor, and a steady voice of truth in turbulent times. Tomorrow, maybe we'll do a better tribute, and maybe over time we'll even have some people share some stories because, as we've said, his wife of 64 years, Shirley, survives him. So do the children, Danae and Ryan, the daughter-in-law, Laura, and the two grandchildren. But first time I think I was with Jim Dobson was really at a National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and that was when I concluded, I don't want to be famous. I remember we sort of walked in together to the exhibit hall, and I went then through the exhibit hall because I was going, at that time, I was not actually a guest host on Point of View. I was just occasionally a guest on Point of View. So I went to find where Marlon Maddox, I should say, where Marlon Maddox and Mary Maddox and everybody were located, and went to the table, said hi, went and saw some other people. And when I went in, Dr. Dobson got stopped by some people at the entrance to the exhibit hall. I go through the entire exhibit hall, and then as I come out, he's still standing there. And I'm thinking, the poor man, he couldn't walk 10 feet if he had to even find the men's room. I mean, it was, of course, an illustration of his popularity. Now, I also was fortunate on more than one occasion to be on Focus on the Family. And what was so interesting is one of his co-hosts, along with the individual that I just mentioned a minute ago, and that is Jim Daly, used to be a co-host of a program at KVNE in Tyler, interestingly enough. So when I came, I got to not only be on with Dr. Dobson, afterwards I got to talk with one of the co-hosts of Focus on the Family at that time and find out a little bit more about what it was like. And I heard a lot of stories, and everybody has a Jim Dobson's story, not the least of which is he certainly wanted to keep his finger on every aspect of Focus on the Family. So people, when they would have meetings, were required to take minutes and then send them to Dr. Dobson. And eventually, when he had his heart attack, I thought, no wonder. I mean, just think of the incredible amount of pressure of keeping the entire institution of Focus on the Family financially solvent, and the pressure of moving such a massive organization down the road. So if nothing else, we have some great memories with him. And the one place where I tended to be a little bit envious of him is, even though you hear the program, it's always pre-taped. And the first time I was ever on with Dr. Dobson on Focus on the Family, he had trouble with even the introduction of the program, had trouble with my credentials. A little bit later, had trouble with a few issues. At one point, stopped the program and said, okay, what's the next question I should ask? And I thought, oh, I wish I could do that on a live program like Point of View, because we're out there without a net, and it was so wonderful to actually hear all those programs, but to know that there were a lot of digital editing that made them sound even better. So anyway, we all have some great memories of Dr. James Dobson, but especially since we mentioned the founder of Point of View, Marlon Maddox, so many times when we have somebody here from Alliance Defending Freedom, Lathan Watts has been the most recent one, Vice President for Public Affairs for ADF, but we've had all sorts of other guests, presidents, past presidents of ADF. We recognize that it would not have existed without the decision by Jim Dobson, as well as, of course, Don Wildman and certainly Bill Bright and D. James Kennedy and Marlon Maddox, and of course, you make the long list of individuals that created ADF in the first place. So that has always been a partnership in terms of ADF. Of course, the interaction between Focus on the Family and Dr. Dobson later at his Family Talk has been something that we've appreciated. And matter of fact, if I can get in a little footnote there, if I remember right, the first time Family Talk aired, one of the co-hosts was Penna Dexter, who had been a co-host here as well. So maybe when we get Penna on, she's going to be in a week from this Friday, might ask her about Dr. Dobson as well, because she has some stories there. But just before we take a break, let me just mention that one of my commentaries, which I think is going to be very important for you to hear, and it won't air till next Monday, is on the subject of debanking. Now, you've heard me talk about it before, but what I think is so intriguing is the fact that this went from an issue that we were talking about 5 years ago, when I first talked about how Nigel Farage, who was a British leader who was debanked because of his involvement in Brexit. And then even during the pandemic, we talked about how, for example, Dr. Joseph McCullough was losing both his personal account and his business account. And then we even began to hear that after Donald Trump left office, then he was getting debanked. I did a commentary about how Melania and his son Barron were debanked. Then we began to hear of Joe Rogan doing an interview with Mark Andreessen, who I know of, who was one of the founders of Netscape and really kind of one of the great scions of Silicon Valley, who then on that program said there were about 30 different tech company founders that had been debanked. We also in the past did talk about how under Operation Choke Point, they were using debanking to actually begin to hurt various gun manufacturers and gun shows. And then with Operation Choke Point 2.0, they were using that to not only go after, of course, people that manufacture guns and go after, of course, even MAGA people, but they were even going after cryptocurrency, which is one of the reasons why Mark Andreessen was talking about that as well. And so anyway, on my piece that's coming out on Monday, I quote from Charles Gasparino, who has covered these stories, but I love his line. I have covered finance for 3 decades now, and I thought I'd saw it all. Bernie Madoff, Epstein, the 2008 financial crisis, Wall Street scandals, penny stock scams, hedge fund implosions. But what happened to Trump in 2021 was truly surprising, given the breadth of big banks dropping him as a client, and scary given their rationale. What I think is so interesting is even just in the last week or so, went from some people saying, I don't understand why people wouldn't take money in the bank, to now seeing major editorials, Wall Street Journal, National Review, even in some of the more liberal outlets, talking about debanking as an issue. So certainly we have, of course, an executive order, but also Senator Tim Scott has a bill called the Financial Integrity and Regulation Management Act, so we'll see where that goes. But we've gone from a time in which we saw debanking as an issue, tried to see and help you see that it was of concern, to the point now where I think most people are recognizing this needs to end, and I think we see maybe the end of it on the horizon. Let's take a break. We'll get into a couple more issues right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow is our weekend edition. And again, we'll have Jeff Mateer as well as Liberty McCarter. We're going to be talking about, Cal Thomas talks about the remarkable number of people moving from blue states to red states, which sort of then maybe justify having some kind of redistricting, which is taking place, as well as what is happening right now in even some of the political parties. If I can quote from the New York Times said, Again, it must be true. Democrats lost about 2.1 million registered voters between 2020 and 2024 in the 30 states, along with Washington, D.C., that allow people to register with political party. In the remaining 20 states, voters did not register with political party, so that's the case. So Republicans gained 2.4 million. And so, again, there are some questions being made about what is the future of the Democratic Party. Now, is it going to fade away? No, we've heard this before. By the way, somebody reminded me, and I forgot about this, New York Times back in the 18th century, if you can believe this, and the 19th century was looking at this, and really it was more in the 19th century, the later part of the 19th century, when they were looking at the Democratic Party and even suggesting that maybe it would fade away, because this was the party of the South, it was the party of segregation, it was losing individuals, there were others that were rejecting that and becoming Republicans. Of course, then it had a revitalization with Woodrow Wilson and a variety of others, and then later Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and even under Lyndon Johnson. But there was a time in which some people were talking about, is the Democratic Party in trouble? They were talking about that at the end of the 19th century. I think it was 1895, I think somebody said. I need to look that up. But it's a reminder of the ebb and flow. There was a time when people wondered if the Republican Party would survive. But nevertheless, those are some issues we'll get into tomorrow, because it really gets into the realignment taking place right before our very eyes, and things are really changing. Of course, because Jeff Mateer will be with us, we'll talk about a couple of the religious liberty cases and others. So I think that you will enjoy the conversations there as well. But just before we wind down, yesterday, I talked about the issue of artificial intelligence. Again, I'll hold up our booklet here. And one of the reasons I even mention these booklets is some of you say, look, I am not going to read a book on, for example, a book that's written by Robert Putnam on bowling alone. I'm certainly not going to read a book on artificial intelligence, but I would like to know something about it. Do you have something I can read in about 10 minutes? And then maybe if I'm really so inclined, could I maybe then find another book or booklet or article? And that's exactly what we try to do with these booklets. And one of the reasons why we encourage you to support the ministry, because that's one of the things we provide to you as a service. But as I've pointed out, so much is changing. I think we'll have to create a new artificial intelligence book, because my commentary yesterday is talking about jobs. And if you look at this, one of the biggest issues before the Trump administration, and it's no small problem, is new job creation in this country is down. And it is sad to say that the Department of Labor seemed to have the wrong statistics. And once we really started looking at this, well, there are all sorts of reasons. And certainly we can talk about tariffs and we can talk about a down economy. But one of the reasons, and I talked about it yesterday in the commentary, was artificial intelligence. You have Microsoft that has laid off thousands of engineers. Right here in the state of Texas, you have CrowdStrike, which slashed its workforce because they said AI is reshaping every industry. And so I quoted from, of course, the CEO of Anthropic, which is one of those Silicon Valley companies. But it was interesting. Axios went to other CEOs, and they wouldn't go on the record, but this particular one was willing to go on and say, look, he thinks that AI eventually could wipe out a lot of these entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment at 10% or 20%, because the bottom line is right now many companies are using AI, artificial intelligence, for what is called augmentation, to help you do your job. But eventually, some of these companies will use AI models for automation to replace your job. And if you don't think so, all you have to do is go on maybe even YouTube and look at a couple of the speeches that were given at the World Economic Forum, and then hear that even although they talk about augmentation in the public sector, as soon as the speech is over, a lot of people have reported to us behind the scenes, they're interested in AI for automation. In other words, so they can have fewer people in their company. And so we don't know when this timeline is going to begin, but it's an illustration that we need to pay attention to AI, which brings me then to my other article, which will be coming out next week. And that is one where this particular writer says it's time to kind of rethink what it means to be human, because he starts with the assumption that we're created in the image of God. But when you look at, and we'll just pick on Optimus, which is the AI-powered humanoid robot, which is produced by Tesla. It actually is babysitting children in one of the videos. It's teaching in schools, serving as a doctor. In another scenario, it sees it working as a waiter and a bartender. And Jeff Dornick says, are we to the point where robots and automation might replace service and even human connection? Of course, while we talk about Tesla, how about Neuralink from Elon Musk, which again could be something that we could merge with our brains. But what is that going to mean exactly? And again, let's recognize that robots, artificial intelligence, these are good things in protecting us from mundane, repetitive, and even dangerous tasks. I still see some of the things that are done in some of these steel mills and say, can't we do a lot more of that with robots? And some of the things that are done with various wires and connections and all sorts of things, even some of the electrical connections. If we have really intelligent robots, we would prevent people from getting burned, electrocuted, killed in one way or another. So there is a value to that. But if you're only thinking about the bottom line and you're not thinking about what it means to be human, that's the other aspect. So that's where I, again, have my piece that's coming out next week on AI and humanity. And one of the reasons why we certainly wanted to make available to you this biblical point of view on artificial intelligence. And as we make that available, you can go to the website and get that information, or you can scroll down to the place where it says viewpoints. If you click on the one on genetic engineering and then click on the place where we offer that biblical point of view on genetic engineering, up pops right there a chance for you to read it. Of course, if you'd like to download it, that was something, or you would like us to send it to you, that is the case. We also have a number of other booklets that are available there. You can see on everything from chemical abortion, abusive churches, which we're originally going to be talking about today, Israel, globalism, wokeness, and much, much more. So those are resources we're making available to you. And certainly we would encourage you to support this ministry, but as long as we can get some people to support this ministry, the rest of you can get it free of charge. And I think that's one of the things we've always wanted to do, because we want to educate you on a variety of different issues. And if you're getting this news and information somewhere else, maybe at Breakpoint with my good friend John Stone Street or a variety of other people, great. But most of the information you're getting probably is only being talked about here on Point of View. So let's, if we can, encourage you to go to the website, find some of that information. And if you want to chip in $10, we'd greatly appreciate it. Let me also thank Megan for help recording the program, taping it, making it available today. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition right here on Point of View.
Point of View began all the way back in 1973 as a listener-supported ministry, and we are still a listener-supported ministry. But out of the hundreds of thousands of Point of View listeners, just 1% donate to keep the program going. Imagine what would happen, how many people we could reach together if the 99% stepped up to donate as well. It doesn't take much to make a difference. In fact, we've done the numbers, and if every listener gave $10, Point of View would be funded for an entire year. If you're in the 99%, why not join the team of listeners who make Point of View a reality for everyone else? Chip in your $10 today. You can give online at pointofview.net. Or you can use your phone and call right now at 1-800-347-5151. Again, that's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.